What I recommend, Mr. Chair, is that we start, we try, and we see. We can verify that the sound is sufficient on Parle View, but it's more an issue to make sure that the sound is sufficient for the members here. What I recommend is you can start the meeting. If we have to suspend due to a technical reason, we can deal with that issue when that happens.
Certainly, and I will, since we do have a quorum, I will call this meeting to order. It's meeting number 16 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates. Today, we will only be meeting for 1 hour from 2 p.m. to, from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. is our normal meeting time. Today, it will be a 1 hour meeting from 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We have one witness rather than three, which was originally scheduled. Our witness is Dr. Stephen Nagy with the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada and the Global Affairs Institute. Colleagues, we will continue with our normal protocols. We will ask Dr. Nagy to make an opening 5-minute statement. Following that, we will engage in questions from committee members. Because we've got off to a bit of a late start, we will have 5-minute questions in the opening round, 4-minute questions in the secondary round, and 2-minute questions in the third and final round. Dr. Nagy, I would ask you that if you were presenting in English, you continue your complete statement in English rather than alternating between the two official languages. That would help our technicians greatly. Colleagues, the same thing when you're asking questions. If you were asking a question en français, continue in that language without alternating back and forth, just to assist our technicians. And with that, colleagues, I think we're ready to go. Dr. Nagy, I will ask you to deliver your opening statement of 5 minutes or less. And Dr. Nagy, the floor is yours.
So good morning from Tokyo. It's about 3 in the morning here, so I apologize if I yawn. So first of all, let me just thank you for the invitation to come and share my views on this important committee. I think it's important for us to be thinking about COVID-19, what its repercussions for Canada is, and how we need to move forward as a country. I'd like to also preface my comments by saying that I'm looking at this particular issue from my speciality, which is international relations and security. And I am based in East Asia. I'm based in Tokyo, and I do most of my research and policy-related work related to China, Japan, and South Korea. So I'm using this vantage point to provide some insight to how I think the COVID-19 pandemic is going to affect Canada. Now, what I'd like to do is, my comments really are what I view are critical for Canada in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I have 3 takeaways that I'd like to convey to you. But most importantly, the theme of my discussion is what I call a new realism in building resilience through partnerships. And that is the take home I would like you all to have, is this idea of resilience through new partnerships. Today's discussion will be broken down into 3 points. The first point is
Dr. Nagy, if I could just interrupt, if you could, yeah, that's right. Hold your microphone a little closer to your mouth. Thank you.
Thank you very much for telling me. So first, I'd like to begin with what I think is the eye openers for Canada in terms of the 4 eye openers for Canadians in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic. Second, I'd like to talk about lessons for Canada, and third, recommendations for Canada. So let me begin with the 4, I think, important take-homes for Canada. The COVID-19 pandemic, especially the initial Chinese government response in downplaying the severity of the coronavirus outbreak, but also the total lockdown of the city of Wuhan and the province of Hebei, revealed to Canada and the world that there is a systemic problem in decision-making in the Chinese government, and that didn't allow for transparent, accountable, and a rules-based approach to the outset of the outbreak. And this has broad implications in terms of how we manage our bilateral relations with China, but it also has important implications in terms of how we move forward in dealing with some of the more difficult issues that Canada and China face at this moment. Second, I think importantly, the total lockdown of Wuhan and Hebei severely affected supply chains and dramatically highlighted the problems of a global production network being centered in one country. We were unable to, the goods that were needed for global export were unable to be produced or exported to other countries, including Canada. until China was able to put the domestic outbreak under control. Third, the COVID-19 pandemic highlighted the degree of friction between the United States and China China. And this is really, really important because what we've seen is an inability of these two important states to come together and marshal their resources to combat the global pandemic. Both states have politicized the issue, and the global pandemic has no end in sight due to this politicization. Fourth, and importantly, I think that the COVID-19 pandemic has made middle powers like Canada more vulnerable to economic and other forms of coercion. Points points 2 to 4, I think, are magnified by the pre-existing Canada-China tensions associated with the Meng Wanzhou arrest, and will continue to intensify as Beijing attempts to pressure Canada to change its decision related to Meng Wanzhou's extradition to the United States. Moving on to the lessons for Canada and this idea of new realism in building resilience through partnerships. I think first, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, it's extremely important to establish both domestic and diverse supply chains of PPE, personal protective equipment, medical equipment, pharmaceuticals, amongst other goods. The United States, Japan, South Korea, and even Taiwan and other like-minded states in the region should work together to form an Indo-Pacific emergency initiative to stockpile equipment, share best practices, establish an information sharing mechanism, as well as other areas of cooperation to ensure that the next pandemic can be quickly understood and the best practices shared, and of course, medical equipment dispersed to needed countries and needed cities as soon as possible. Second, a smart approach to selective decoupling must occur. And what I mean by that is diversification of supply chains within and outside China. And this is an important distinction. The supply chain that was disrupted within Wuhan and Hebei had significantly affected exports out of that region. Canadian businesses shouldn't put all of their manufacturing sites in one aspect of one area of China, but they should diversify within China. That being said, the political difficulties that we are increasingly experiencing with regards to China also mean that we need to diversify our supply chains outside of China as well. And that's what I mean by a smart approach to selective decoupling. Third, I think there's an important need for pandemic sharing strategies. And the key candidates here, I think, is Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, and Australia. They're not perfect matches for Canada, but each has ideas to mitigate another COVID-19 wave or transnational disease. Moving forward in terms of recommendations, I think one of the important areas that Canada needs to think seriously about is what I call enhanced cooperation with other middle powers. So middle powers include Japan, South Korea, Australia, many European states. And these states have shared values and a shared understanding of rule of law and rules-based behavior. Through enhanced middle power cooperation, Canada and other middle powers need to lobby the United States to return to multilateralism and work more effectively with the United States in building more resilient supply chains, of course, in North America, but resilient supply chains with like-minded countries.
I'll have to get you to wrap it up as quickly as you can, Doctor,
All right.
please.
Great. Thank you very much. I'll just end with two other points, that this middle power alignment needs to work quickly to engage in WT reform to ensure that economic coercion and other forms of coercion cannot be deployed against Canada and other middle powers. And lastly, I'm advocating for something called a musketeer clause in trade agreements that would include a clause that required partners to collectively respond to economic coercion of one of its members, but also to come to aid of its members when there is a pandemic occurring within the region or within their country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll now go to our first 5-minute round of intervention, starting with Mr. Jennis. 5 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, Dr. Nagy, and I appreciate your testimony. It really is unfortunate that right now the Canada-China Committee is not able to meet. We have a situation here where the government has worked to prevent the Canada-China Committee from meeting, because I think your testimony would be of great interest to that committee as well, especially during these times. And I hope we'll be able to find an opportunity for you to come share your perspective in more detail before the Canada-China Relations Committee. To start off, you talked about how the COVID-19 response from the Chinese government demonstrated some significant structural problems. I note that the government's ambassador, Dominic Barton, told the Canada-China Relations Committee when he testified a few months ago, quote, "I commend what China is doing in trying to contain this and the effort that's underway on that front." Are you surprised that Canada's ambassador to China was praising the Chinese government's response to COVID-19? And what do you think that suggests perhaps about the naivete or in any other sense? What does that suggest about the government's approach to China at the current time?
So I think importantly, we should understand that the initial days of the outbreak in China of the coronavirus, the decision-making process was frozen due to systemic challenges within the Chinese government associated with the deepening authoritarian rule under Xi Jinping. This should be differentiated from the decision to lock down Wuhan and Hebei and marshal national resources to fight the virus in both Wuhan and Hebei. And what we've seen is that once the decision was made to marshal resources, that the Chinese government was able to effectively, if not in an inhumane way, control the spread of the virus within China. And I think that distinction is very, very important. And I think the ambassador's comments are reflective of that distinction rather than naivety about the Chinese response. Again, I think we should emphasize that the initial response was a disaster, but once the decision was made to marshal resources, the Chinese government has been able to employ not only technology but significant resources to curb the spread in China.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a charitable reading of the ambassador's comments, but I appreciate the information you've provided about that response. In terms of Canada's engagement with China and the kind of multilateral partnerships that are created, I know you've been critical of, for instance, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Canada is a member of that bank, spending hundreds of millions of dollars to be part of that bank, which is part of the wider Belt and Road Initiative. I think it would be hard for a lot of Canadians to understand why we are funding a Chinese government-controlled development bank, which is part of an agenda to bring other countries into its sphere of influence, when perhaps we could be directing those resources through other development banks or partnering directly with developing countries. Could you share your thoughts on the AIIB, on the wisdom of Canadian participation in that, and on possible alternatives?
So I think there's a very important saying that we should keep in mind when we're thinking about Canadian participation in the AIIB. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And I think any participation by Canada in an international organization means that Canadian values and Canadian interests are represented. So from the standpoint of Canada's participation in the AIIB, I think that Canada's participation provides a voice and allows the shaping of the AIIB so that it functions based on transparency, accountability, and international standards. I think the initial fears when the AIIB was founded by China was that it would be an instrument of the Communist Party of China. But what we've seen is the internationalization of governance of the AIIB, allowing it to be a much more effective institution in terms of deploying aid and loans to governments within the region that are interested in building infrastructure.
Can I just quickly follow up on that, though? I mean, China controls, from what I understand, over 40% of the voting shares. Canada will have less than 1% of the voting shares. We've seen the way China has entered into these kind of controlling debt arrangements with countries like Sri Lanka. How is that consistent with what you just said?
I think that you need to distinguish
very briefly, Doctor, very briefly.
Thank you. You need to distinguish between the AIB and the Memorandum of Understandings of the BRI, and these are very different. And what we've seen is, for example, the ports in Sri Lanka. This was the debt trap diplomacy that many scholars and researchers are criticizing China for in the Sri Lankan case has been associated with the BRI and not the AIB. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll now go to a 5-minute round with Mr. Weiler. Mr. Weiler, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Nagy, for joining our committee today, and especially for joining so late in the evening for you. It's much appreciated that you're sharing your wisdom, and I really appreciate your opening and some of your takeaways. Maybe first, I'd just like to start with an overarching strategy or an overarching question, and that's what do you see as an effective engagement strategy, or what would an effective engagement strategy with China look like?
Thank you very much for the question. I think that Canada needs to work with like-minded countries to form a critical mass of diplomacy, economic resources, and other resources to ensure that any kind of engagement with China is more symmetric. And that is a critical aspect of dealing with China, is that its asymmetric advantages in terms of economic size, in terms of its diplomatic size and other advantages, means that smaller countries are always in a position of disadvantage. So importantly, we need to move forward and work with like-minded countries to advocate for Canadian values and a rules-based approach to dealing with China.
And Mr. Nagy, do you have some examples of where similar examples of where like-minded middle power countries have come together in this type of a situation?
I think we've moved into a very different period in terms of international affairs, in which China is using middle powers relationships with the United States and its asymmetric economic relationships with other middle powers to shape their decisions. And I think a very good example of that, of course, is the decision of Ms. Meng Wanzhou with the British Columbia government making a decision to proceed with the extradition cases. And what we've seen is the Chinese government use punitive economic measures against Canadian businesses and the Canadian agriculture community to try and shape Canadian behavior. Moving forward, and again, this goes back to my proposition about a musketeer clause, is that Canada needs to forge partnerships and forge trade agreements and forge international agreements with other middle powers in which they agree to back each other when China is applying punitive economic measures. So this is something more looking forward, what Canada can do, and how Canada can exert a leadership position and bring together like-minded countries to pressure China, but also protect Canadian interests.
Thank you. And you in your observations earlier, you mentioned the ongoing conflict between China and the United States of America. How does a country like Canada avoid being caught in the middle of such a conflict?
Well, as we know, the United States has turned into a different direction over the past 3 years under the current administration in the White House, and our traditional relationship has, I think, in many ways become much less predictable. But moving forward, I think that it's important for Canada to continue to strengthen its trade relationship with the United States, the trade relationship within NAFTA 2.0, but also diversify its relationships and strengthen relationships not only with the United States, but with European Union partners, but importantly, countries within East Asia where I'm based, Japan, South Korea, parts of China such as Taiwan. All of these countries share similar values and in many ways complementary economies that I think can strengthen Canada's position within the region, give it insight in how to deal with countries like China, and really start to build a collective approach to managing some of the challenges that are moving forward as the United States and China's rivalry becomes more serious, and unfortunately, it's going to have boomerang effects on countries such as Canada, Australia, Japan, and others.
Absolutely, and one of your recommendations coming out of this was that 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 Canada should look to lobby the United States to return to multilateralism and to do this with like-minded countries. And do you think this would be an effective and a likely scenario that this type of engagement would be able to lead the United States in this type of direction?
Doctor, I would ask, since we're basically out of time, I would ask that you provide your answer to that question from Mr. Weiler in written form and direct that as soon as possible to our clerk. We'll now go to our third intervention from Madame Vignola. 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Nagy. Thank you for being here so late, because today you will go to bed at the time where I usually go to bed. So your expertise is very interesting, and I have a lot of questions. And we've talked briefly about Madame Wang Zhu. Knowing that she was jailed at the request of the U.S., it meant that there were economic consequences on the part of China on Canada and on what's produced in Quebec. So what would be the consequences of what China could impose following the judgment that Mrs. Wang Zhu got this week? Thank you for the question.
So I think what we should be expecting is that China will likely continue to target our agricultural industry, and they will likely target our agricultural industry through questionable enforcement of domestic regulations. So increase the number of regulations on imports going into China. China also has a practice of complicating imports, how they come into China, and I think that we should expect that for Canadian agricultural products, poultry, pork, and other products. I think that we could also see that visas into China, Canadian companies that are wanting to start up businesses in China, that the process and the paper could be complicated, making Canadian engagement challenged in the Chinese context.
D'accord. Vous parliez.
Very well. So you were talking about multilateral agreements. So would one of the solutions for Canada would be to produce more on its in its own territory instead of depending one from another?
So I think when we're thinking about how to manage selective decoupling, there's certain industries that I think we will have to seriously consider of reshoring back to Canada. And this could be personal protective equipment, other forms of medical equipment, some pharmaceuticals. But we need to be realistic about the comparative advantages that Canada has. So I think moving forward that we need to find perhaps more reliable partners to work with, not only in terms of being like-minded countries, but reliable.
Doctor, once again, I hate to interrupt you once again. If you could keep the microphone up, thanks.
Yeah. So we need to continue to work with reliable partners that can provide those essential medical equipments and other equipment that Canada needs in the case of COVID-19. But we do need to be realistic that it's going to be very difficult to replace many aspects of the global production network that is centered in China in the short term. But over the mid to long term, again, working with the United States, working with other like-minded countries, we need to start to diversify those supply chains within China, but also globally.
Merci. Dans votre allocution,
Thank you. In your speech, you mentioned the lack of transparency of China, and more we're talking about having an independent inquiry. Mrs. Gold was saying recently that it shouldn't be up to the WHO to order that investigation, but up to the member countries. So how can Canada and its partner can require from China more transparency? Because we know that because of COVID-19 and its impacts, the methods differ from one country to another. So how can we make sure that China will accept more transparency?
So I think a focus on good governance is really crucial in terms of convincing China to move forward on some kind of international investigation to improve their responses to an emerging pandemic, as we've seen with the COVID-19. China does not respond well to shaming. Its response when it's shamed internationally is to double down. I think more effective ways for Canada to engage with China.
Doctor, I know you've got more to say, and I do apologize once again for interrupting, but if you could complete your thoughts in written form and send that answer as soon as possible to our clerk, I would appreciate it, as would Madame Vignola. We'll now go to our next round of questioning from Mr. Green for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just want to confirm that the sound and everything should be okay by now. Sounds like it's improved.
It's gotten much better.
Outstanding. I've been watching with interest what appears to be a kind of a conservative about face on China. So I'm going to put this to our guest, Mr. Nagy, and then ask for his response. Former Prime Minister Stephen Harper's Conservative government signed an agreement between the Government of Canada and the Government of the People's Republic of China for the promotion and reciprocal protection of investments, commonly known as FIPA. With China, that was September 9th, 2012. They didn't even release the full text public. They went again and ratified the agreement 2 years later, despite warnings from experts in labor, from human rights and environmental advocates, that the agreement was detrimental to Canada's interest. Specifically, Article 11 of FIPA states that if Chinese firms in Canada suffer losses due to war, state of national emergency, insurrection, riot, or other similar events, they can sue the Canadian government for compensation. I'm wondering if you could comment on what impacts FIPA might have on a shift in Canadian policy of procurement as it relates to China.
Thank you very much for the question. Although I'm not an legal expert, and my understanding of FIPA is probably not as strong as it should be, I think that when we're looking at Canadian engagement with China, first and foremost, we should understand that the legal environment within China is not ruled by law. It's so it's not rule of law. It's ruled by law. And that's an important distinction when we're understanding how Canadian governments are investing within China, that they're subject to the legal system that is produced by the Communist Party of China, which is subject to shifts in the Communist Party of China. And this is very different from the Canadian context, where a rule of law system means that the court system has an independent decision-making process that can protect businesses and give them a predictable environment. So in my understanding, I think when we're looking at trade agreements with China, and we're looking at instruments such as FIPA, that we should not be naive to think that we'll receive reciprocal treatment in China. And I'll stop there.
Okay, and no, I certainly appreciate that. I've been trying to balance the economic coercion that China has put during this, but also the United States of America, and I've yet to hear anybody speaking directly about that. Is that something you would care to comment? We've heard horror stories of the Trump government, bribing people on runways to have shipments redirected. Is it something that you're familiar with and would care to comment on?
No, I'm not familiar with these kinds of rumors, but I do think that we should be aware as Canadians that we've already been victims of economic coercion from the United States in terms of the renegotiation process of NAFTA 2.0 with steel tariffs. And I think that if we have a re-elected President Trump, that we should continue to expect this kind of behavior from the United States. If in the case that we have a new president, President Biden, I don't think that these taxes will disappear, but I think they will probably be softened and they'll be couched within a more multilateral mindset of a potential Biden administration.
I appreciate that feedback. Again, I'm still trying to figure out the about face by my conservative friends. It says here that on September 16th, interim conservative leader Rona Ambrose said that China has made billions of dollars in investments in the oil and gas sector and want nothing more than to get those commodities to the tidewater. I hope that the Prime Minister listens to the Chinese because they want those commodities and they want to see energy infrastructure built. As it relates to selective decoupling and foreign influence on our national resources, what risk of economic coercion could Canada face with our reliance on Chinese investment in the oil and gas sector, and if we rely on them to become a significant importer of Canadian oil?
You got about 30 seconds, Doctor, about 30 seconds.
Thank you
I
very
have
much.
myself at 4:30. Are we only doing a 5-minute round?
We are. I mentioned that at the outset.
My apologies.
So in the COVID-19 era, we've seen all economies slow down significantly, and as a result, we've seen global oil prices also decrease. And this is going to be a heavy blow for our natural resource industries in Alberta and Saskatchewan. And I think that this is going to make your question somewhat of a moot point, that China will not be able to invest profitably in our energy sector going forward.
Thank you very much. We'll now go to a 4-minute round of questioning, once again starting with Mr. Genuis. Mr. Genuis.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. It is a bit rich to hear a member from the Socialist Party talking about an about face. They voted against bringing back the Canada-China Committee a week ago, and then we're telling the National Post something different about 48 hours later. But I'll let Mr. Green explain that, and I'm sure he'll be keen to. Dr. Nagy, could you just speak a little bit about the possible implications of Chinese aggression outside of the economic sphere, what we're seeing in Hong Kong, what we're seeing in across the border in India? I'm sure escalating fears related to that in Japan about possible action in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. What should we be tracking there, and what should we be doing to prepare to respond?
In order of priority, I would prioritize Taiwan and cross-strait relations. Second, I would prioritize the instability that's occurring in Hong Kong. Third, I would prioritize increased presence of Chinese naval ships in the South China Sea and the potential declaration of what's called an air defense identification zone. And lastly, some kind of potential friction between the Japanese and the Chinese over the Senkaku Islands in East China Sea. Taiwan has managed the COVID-19 crisis extremely well. It's had a successful election in January, and these are all, really challenges to the communist regime in China. And they look at this, and this will become. It makes it more imperative, more than ever, to try to push reunification as soon as possible. In terms of Hong Kong, Hong Kong will have the 31st anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre this Friday on June 4th. And I do expect that there'll be huge protests and violence in commemorating the massacre, but also protesting against the recently adopted National Security Act by the Chinese government. This will continue to be a problem, and we're going to most likely see Chinese intervention in Hong Kong, which will fundamentally disrupt Hong Kong's role as an international finance center going forward. I'll stop in the South China Sea area, but again, China is expanding its presence in the South China Sea through consolidation of its territories or its artificial islands in the South China Sea, but also deploying more and more resources above and on the surface of the South China Sea, but also submarine resources and other resources to really dominate the underwater environment in the South China Sea.
Thank you. And then just to follow up on the first round about the AIIB-BRI distinction, you said we're talking about two different things. Conceptually, we are, but the AIIB is part of the BRI, a relatively small part of it. Arguably, it's sort of the public relations part of it, where the AIIB is a little bit more public facing in terms of what it does. It's still very much dominated by the Chinese government. So. I mean, going back to your point about maybe having some Canadian influence on this, we're less than 1% of the AIIB, which is a relative speck in the larger sea of the BRI. we know what the BRI is all about. You've talked about it. Why? How do we make, like, on what basis would we want to make the case to Canadian taxpayers that it's worth their money to be anywhere near these kinds of strategic vehicles?
Once again, unfortunately, Doctor, we're out of time. I would ask that while it was a very good question, you answer that in writing at your first opportunity and deliver that to our clerk. But now we will go to our next 4-minute intervention to Mr. McKinnon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, I'll allow Dr. Nagy to answer that question. What I'm taking from the Conservatives is it's we don't need to have a relationship with 1/6 of the planet with a growing economy. We don't need to be able to sell our agricultural or other commodities into China. We should just hang up the phone and not deal with them at all.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. Point of order.
Yes, go ahead, Mr. Genuis.
Mr. McKinnon is casting aspersions that have nothing to do with the substance of this. What he's saying is false. It's completely false, and he should spend his time talking about his position rather than making things up about other people's positions.
Mr. Genuis, I will take that as a point of debate, not a point of order. Go ahead, Mr. McKinnon.
And I'll welcome the member to the committee. Dr. Nagy, what we've seen is that we absolutely, of course, need to have China in a rules-based international order. I take your point very seriously that Canada needs to work with other powers, maybe through the TPP, through other fora, in terms of engaging China, but China must be dealt with. Just wondering if you wanted to answer Mr. Genuis's last question and perhaps address that point as well.
So I think the key aspect of your discussion is how do we manage
microphone, please, Doctor. Microphone.
The key aspect of your question is, do we continue engaging with China? And I say absolutely, we need to continue to engage with China. It is, as you mentioned, 1/6 of the population. If we're going to deal with global climate change, the next global pandemic, if we're going to deal with North Korean denuclearization or the militarization of the East and South China Sea, we have to discuss things with the Chinese. We have to create crosswalks in terms of policy discussions, and we have to develop a better understanding of what's happening within the party, what's happening within the country. To not do so would put Canada and other middle powers at great risk. The question is, and I think this goes to Mr. Genuis's discussion, is what's the best way to engage in China? And I'm going back to my initial comments, is that we need to do it collectively. We need to work with like-minded countries, and we need to have a strong rules-based approach that is backed up by the United States. And this goes back to one of my key points, is that we need to pull the United States back from an American first.
Yeah. Let me just move on, perhaps,
point of view.
if I might, just in terms of the infrastructure bank. Mr. Genuis's argument seems to be that we're too small to be bothered with this. Wouldn't you flip that argument on its head and say this is cheap at twice the price for having influence in such a burgeoning and emerging series of investments where Canada can be present participant and also get a front row seat in terms of this growth?
So when we look at
very brief answer, sir.
When we look at the governance of the AIB, we should be clear that it's not just Canadians there and Chinese. There's British, there's French, there's Germans, there's others. We work as a force multiplier to push our views, and this is where I think why Canada should be part of this this organization, and why Canada should continue to work with other like-minded countries to ensure that it functions through international standards. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll now go to, again, a 4-minute round of intervention. I understand, Mrs. Block, you're going to be splitting your time with Mr. Genuis. But Mrs. Block, I have you up first.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and my apologies for joining the committee late. I am going to start off my time by moving the motion that I put on notice last week. It's a lengthy motion. I do not intend to read it into the record, but I would just read the first part, that in the context of its study of the government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic and pursuant to Standing Order 108-1A, the committee send for the following documents to be provided by the government by Friday, June 26, 2020. I believe all members have the 11 points that make up my motion. And I would simply say that I acknowledge it's a broad request for documents, but that transparency during this time is very important. It's important all the time, but certainly during this unprecedented time. There is a deadline that I think reflects the importance of that transparency. It allows for reasonable time for the documents to be collected. So I table that motion for consideration by the committee today, and then I will turn the rest of my time over to my colleague, Mr. Generous.
Thank you. And colleagues, the motion is in order. It is debatable, of course, if we have comments to make, and it is amendable. So I'm looking for anyone who may want to speak to the motion presented by Mrs. Block. And Paul, if you can help me out, I do not see any hands raised.
Mr. Drouin and Mr. Green have raised their hands.
Okay, I see that now. Mr. Dewan, you are first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And we just want to signal that as the motion is written right now, we would not be supporting it. There's a few issues that we do recognize that could be problematic along the same lines as Mr. Green's motion last week. The timing, as you know, we've proposed an August 30th timeline, and we would be proposing a friendly amendment to that. As well, just adding the clause, senior officials in matters of cabinet confidence. But also the way the motion is written is we could potentially divulge all of the commercial suppliers, and I know that I'm assuming that Ms. Block wouldn't want to do that, as we know personal protection equipment does not come in an abundant supply as we speak today, and we wouldn't want to potentially affect the supply chain to Canada, and also to by Canada I also mean to provinces. We know that 80% of the material that is currently procured for Canada is then transferred to provinces. So I would like to propose a friendly amendment, and I will read it into the record, which states and starts by that in the context of its studies of the government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic and pursuant to Standing Order 1081A, the committee send for the following documents from senior officials in that matters of cabinet confidence, national security, commercial sensitivity, and matters that could jeopardize Canada's ability to procure and distribute personal protective equipment and other life-saving medical equipment to provinces and territories be excluded from the request, and then to be provided by the government by August 30th, 2020.
Thank you very much. We will now be debating and discussing the amendment. Mr. Green, I have your hand next.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm seeking clarification on what the extension is of cabinet confidence as it relates to legal opinions and its relationship to our parliamentary privileges as members of parliament to being able to seek adequate clarification or adequate information to make decisions. So in the amendment, does that exclude any type of legal opinions? And if so, on what basis?
Are you asking, excuse me, are you asking a question of Mr. Dewan, Mr. Green?
If he has that, but I would suggest maybe the clerks might be better positioned. I don't know if there's.
I'll go to Mr. Dewan first, and then we'll turn our ways back to.
I know what his answer is going to be, but that's okay. We can hear it.
Go ahead, Francis, first.
I'm sorry, I missed part of that, Mr. Green. You're suggesting that if the amendment that we are proposing may exclude legal advice?
Correct. I'm testing what the extension is of cabinet confidentiality as it relates to legal opinions versus our parliamentary privileges as members to have access to adequate information to be able to make decisions.
Mr. Chair, I don't have the initials LLB at the end of my title. I would defer probably to the clerks, but I would also imagine that there is a client solicitor privilege normally when legal advice is provided to any clients, which in this case would be the government, then that may be excluded, but I'm not sure.
I don't know if Milliken has some kind of jurisprudence on this, but I would like to know.
I'm looking, Paul, to see if there are any other. Madame Vignola, please.
Mr. Chair, just on a point of order, I think the question was referred to the clerk for a response. I haven't received that. All I got was I got a personal opinion from Mr. Drouin and not a legal one.
I have not referred it to the clerk for any response as yet, Mr. Green. We're going to hear all comments first, and then we'll come back. Madame Vignola.
So if Ms. Block agrees to push back the deadline, that's fine with me. But of course, there's the confidentiality issue. That's something I'm concerned about as well, because we have had problems where at the last minute brown envelopes were set out and that our personal protective equipment suddenly disappeared on the tarmac. So if we could obtain information while preserving the security aspect, I think the motion would work for me.
Thank you. I'm looking to see if there are any other speakers. Seeing none. Paul, I'd like to engage you for a moment. Oh, Mr. McCauley, I see your hand raised.
Thank you very much. Delaying it, I would be perhaps fine if we maybe delayed it to the end of July. I would like to see these documents before the House rises for their for the full summer. I understand we're going to have a couple August sessions. Be nice to have this information to perhaps debate in the even fake House of Commons that's going on. And I see nothing wrong with bringing to light the names of these suppliers. Let's be blunt here. These suppliers overseas have ripped off Canadians. They've sold us bad product that could put Canadian lives at risk. And we've seen repeatedly from PSPC defending these suppliers. In fact, in our first meeting in defending these suppliers of contaminated goods, Mr. Matthews said they have long-standing relationships with them. I think Canadians have every right to know who these companies are putting Canadians' lives, nurses, doctors, seniors at risk. I have no idea why the Liberal Party would decide to choose secrecy to protect these, frankly, disreputable companies over instead of standing up for, again, the health and safety of Canadians and our healthcare workers.
I'm looking for any other hands. Seeing none.
Mr. Drouin has raised his hand again, Mr. Chair.
I'm sorry, Francis, I missed that. Please go ahead.
Yeah, and if I can just provide some clarity to Mr. McCauley. Obviously, as he knows, I know he's been a member of OGGO for quite a long time. All government contracts are normally published online. Everyone can go see them. But I think in this circumstances, it's not as if we're buying McDonald's hamburgers. They're not everywhere across Canada, and the whole world is trying to procure. So there are successful suppliers. I think it's very I don't think it's very prudent for us to publish the suppliers right now as it stands, so we can tell the whole world, hey, we've got a great supplier in China or wherever it may be. And by the way, why don't you guys go all the way there and procure and potentially increase the price that Canada is currently buying at? I just don't see that as a prudent approach.
Any other, Mr. McCauley, once more?
Yeah, I'll just respond to that is if you were watching the virtual parliament, the fake parliament today, you saw the Minister Nan go on and on and on about how many great Canadian suppliers are already producing N95 masks. I don't believe that's true, but she states it's true. Listed off so many that, frankly, if this information is provided for this committee by the end of July, according to Mr. Nan, our Minister Nan, will have more than enough domestically produced suppliers that we won't have to worry about the one or two odd ones and trying to getting stolen from us. And frankly, we're not getting any decent PPE of the masks out of China. Again, I don't know why we're continuing to try and cover up and hide the names of these disreputable suppliers, especially when the minister herself today bragged on and on and on about how many great companies in Canada were producing PPE and masks right now. Surely if they're doing so at the beginning of June, we'll ramp up enough by the end of July that we won't be having to rely on disreputable or dishonest foreign suppliers.
Now we have Mr. McKinnon again.
Not again, actually. First time, Mr. Chair.
Sorry, Steve. I'll take that back. Mr. McKinnon.
I just want to respond perhaps briefly to Mr. Macaulay. I haven't had a chance to review the transcript that he cited in terms of Mr. Matthews' testimony. But I think he may be conflating two issues. Mr. Matthews did talk about potential problems in the supply chain and did talk about longstanding relationships. I don't think he ever necessarily combined the two, but I would want to reserve the ability to review his testimony. And I will begin with the assumption that Mr. Macaulay didn't mean to quote him out of, or even paraphrase him out of context. The second issue is I don't think the Minister of Public Services and Procurement has ever maintained that we can entirely replace Asian, Chinese, or other international supply arrangements with entirely Canadian industrial capacity. But I think very much the point that she makes is that we are succeeding in bending that curve and in diversifying our supply arrangements and in creating some very real success stories here in Canada with respect to PPE and other commodities that we are obviously proving to be very adept at producing here in Canada. But I think on the larger point, and I'll finish on this, Mr. Chairman, is that the motion that is before us, I'm speaking now to the main motion, even though I think technically we're still on the amendment, is very broad and very all-encompassing and involves all of the same people, would involve all of the same people in replying to it who are involved precisely in securing supplies of personal protective equipment for Canadians and essential workers as we speak. It is an unreasonable timeline. In fact, I think even an August timeline is an unreasonable timeline for the amount of information that's been requested. No one is disputing Parliament's right or ability, of course, to examine in the fullness of time all of this information, but it will take a considerable amount of time and effort on the part of senior people to compile it all. And understanding that must be done, I would ask and call upon the reasonableness of my colleagues across the way and in affording more time and in somewhat limiting the scope of the request so that we can get them the information they're looking for and do so in a reasonable amount of time and not imperil the efforts, the very considerable efforts that we have underway to secure this incredibly important equipment for Canadians. Thank you.
Thank you. I have two more speakers that I see to date. One is Mrs. Block, followed by Madame Vignola. Mrs. Block, please.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I do appreciate all of the interventions made by my colleagues. Of course, I would view the amendments that were put forward by Mr. Drouin as friendly. I think there's probably still some debate between my colleague, Mr. Macaulay, and perhaps Mr. Drouin when it comes to the deadline. But I would see both of these amendments as friendly. I guess I have one question that I would want to put to the clerk, and that is, can we request that commercial sensitivity be assessed by the law clerk and parliamentary counsel of the House of Commons?
Perhaps I will break from tradition here and go to Paul now before we go to Madame Vignola on this specific question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair. With regard to the competing privileges that exist, for example, Mr. Green mentioned the privilege that parliamentarians hold versus the privilege that cabinet confidentiality holds. And for example, Ms. Block also talks about the sensitivity of commercial information that may not be permissible for a committee to ask, but what constitutes that. These are questions that I'm going to be very honest with you, to some degree, are in a legal context and outstrip my specific expertise. What I would say to the committee is that the committee can always ask for the documentation. The committee may not receive it. In the event that the committee, having sent for documents, does not receive the documents, the only thing the committee can do at that point is report to the House and allow the House to pursue this. And some members may remember in 2009, 2010, this is what happened with the Afghan detainee issue that led to a seminal ruling by Speaker Milliken. My best arguments to the committee would be, if you're not sure, then in this case of knowing whether one privilege applies or not, is to put it forward and see what documents are presented back to you. And at that point, the committee can then decide, if it doesn't receive the documents it wants, how it wishes to proceed further. Aside from that, if you want a more definitive answer, I would have to check the law clerk's office. At that point, I would have to say that I can't give you an answer right at this moment before you decide. So I hope that's clear. I'm not entirely sure it is, but that's what I can offer you at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Madame Vignola, please.
C'était simple.
Well, I don't know if it's my role, but it's simply to ask, since we're discussing if we can let Mr. Nagy go and rest now, since we will no doubt go beyond 3 o'clock. But I don't know if it's my role or not to say this.
Adhere to our deadline of 3 p.m. Eastern. I see no other hands raised. Oh, Mr. Dewan, I do see a hand now.
Mr. Chair, if I can make a recommendation, and I'm not sure if Ms. Block would agree, but perhaps given that there's 1 minute left to our official time, can we take it offline and we can have a discussion so we can have this as both parties and all parties can agree to something so we can actually move forward on that particular motion?
Well, if Mrs. Block agrees to that and temporarily withdraws her motion for discussion, I think that would be a pretty valuable compromise. But Mrs. Block, I'll go to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the suggestion by my colleague, and I would agree to withdrawing my motion temporarily so that we can get that clarification and have those conversations.
All right, Mr. Green.
And I don't know, again, Mr. Chair, if this is the appropriate time, but is it possible for us to actually invite the parliamentary law clerk to committee?
Well, if you're talking about inviting the law clerk to discuss this particular motion, then now would not be an appropriate time to do that. We would have to deal with the amended motion first. So
yes, no, not this motion in particular, generally speaking.
Well, you can always, the committee now has full restorative powers, Mr. Green, and that was decided about a couple of weeks ago. So whether or not it's to discuss COVID-19 or any other matters, this committee certainly has the powers to invite any witnesses it wants, including the law clerk. But with that, colleagues, seeing that we have an agreement, I believe, between Mrs. Block and Mr. Dewan for Mrs. Block to temporarily withdraw her motion, so a discussion could be held offline, and she may want to reintroduce that motion after that discussion takes place.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, Mr. Clerk.
If I may ask on a minor point of procedure, it does require the unanimous consent of the committee to withdraw a motion. If I may ask if you can canvass that, or alternatively, I can put that to a question by recorded division to ensure that all the members of the committee are in agreement with withdrawing the motion.
Yes, I would. Thank you, Paul. I would ask that you put that to a recorded vote. And that is, of course, colleagues, as discussed, for Mrs. Block to temporarily withdraw her motion. Paul, if you can do the roll now.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the subject is on whether to withdraw the amendment of Ms. Block and the motion of Ms. Block, and by extension, the amendment that Mr. Drouin put forward. I will call the names now. Monsieur Drouin. Monsieur Drouin.
D'accord.
Mr. Joe Howery.
Support, yes.
Mr. Kuzmierczak.
Support.
Mr. McKinnon.
We.
Mr. Weiler.
Support.
Mr. Genuis.
He's not. Oh.
Agreed.
Ms. Block.
Yes.
Mr. McCauley. I'm sorry, Mr. McCauley, I couldn't hear you. You were on mute.
Yes, thank you.
Madame Vignola.
Oui. Yes.
Mr. Green.
Support.
Mr. Chair, that is 10 in favor, 0 against.
Thank you very much. Mr. Dr. Nagy, I do want to say we thank you for your appearances today. Unfortunately, your testimony was cut short somewhat because of our discussion regarding this motion, but I think on behalf of the entire committee, want to sincerely applaud you for staying awake until 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock a.m. Tokyo time to discuss your views and your opinions with our committee. It is very much appreciated, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to question you again sometime in the near future. Colleagues, with that, we are now adjourned.